Well, for the benefit of the recording, welcome back, everyone. So session 2, we had a little look this morning when listing out some of the data types. We refer to those as primitive data types, in terms of referring to their almost like their simplicity, if you will, the sort of like most basic building blocks of the forms of data that we can utilize in JavaScript. So this afternoon, we're going to have a little look at non-primitive data types. Also, you may see them referred to as like complex data types or compound data types. But the two that we're going to be focusing on here are arrays and objects. And effectively, arrays and objects can act as containers to house other data types. So let's have a little look at why we might want to be using one of these. So let me just bring up our coding sandbox here. We've looked at storing data in variables for use later on throughout our program. If, however, we were to have like many individual pieces of data that are in some way related, storing in several individual variables can become a little bit tedious and a little bit tricky to manage as our code lengthens. So, for example, if I were to declare a variable here, we're going dog name themed this afternoon. So I'm going to say like dog name 1 is the string max. Like dog name 2. In fact, you'll have to forgive me. I should have asked for some dog names, but I've already written some examples up. So take no offense. I've got Fido here and dog name 3 being the string of, I've gone for Muttley here. So at this moment in time, technically nothing wrong with what we're doing here, right? We've got 3 pieces of information. We've stored those 3 pieces of data in 3 distinct variables. However, it's perfectly reasonable that if we were to have many, many dog names, this could get quite out of hand quite quickly. As our code lengthens, it's just going to be much, much harder to read, much harder to reason about what's going on in the code. We're abandoning some good naming conventions here, just as like dog name 1 to a dog name 1047, depending on how far we need to go. Storing certain values in an additional container is going to be a really nice and useful way to keep all of this related data sort of kept together. So let me just clear some of those away just for clarity here. So our non-primitive data types, so the first one we're going to take a look at is arrays. Arrays can be used to just house other values. So we can have an array of related data. So for example, if we have a series of dog names, we could sort of group those together. Like that sort of like logically makes sense why they might be in relation to one another. Now, arrays are effectively ordered lists of values. So because they are ordered, it might also be reasonable. It might also be reasonable to sort of store ordered information in an array. So something like days of the week. They can all be represented as strings like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, etc. But the order in which they occur could be considered quite paramount to the way in which they're stored. They're not just a random selection of data. The actual order is crucial. If we find ourselves sort of like straying away from decent naming conventions because we've got so many variables and it's getting a little bit hard to manage, we can store all of these in an array instead. So arrays can be stored in variables and declared in a variable, just like our primitive values above. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare myself an array here, and I'm going to call it dog names and set that equal to these 2 square brackets, opening and closing here. So what we've done at this point is we've declared a variable in the exact same way, and we've used the assignment operator and said this is equal to now an array. So this syntax of just those 2 square brackets is known as array literal syntax. Just we have literally created an array ready to house additional data. So if I'm going to get rid of these dog names now up here, and we'll just keep our array, and we could then store them inside of here. So then we had like max. And what I'm going to do is just inside of these square brackets, just provide the exact same values, so these string pieces of data, and I'm going to use commas just to separate each value inside of this array, inside of this list of values. So another string, Fido, and I think last but not least we had Muttley. And let's just console log. Let's see this dog names array as it appears. So if we run that code, we can see we're seeing those array brackets, and there are 3 values inside of here: Max, Fido, and Muttley. And we can see that they are indeed string values. Cool. So one other thing I would just like to sort of mention in terms of like the naming convention here, deciding on names for your variables, strangely enough, can actually be very, very tricky. You can spend a lot of time thinking, what is this value meant to be? It can be quite hard to give it a reasonable name. A really nice convention for arrays is that because they are designed to house multiple values, in this case, all these values are individually referred to as a dog name. It's quite a nice convention to have a pluralized variable name for that array. So it reads quite semantically, where we can say, oh, this is an array of dog names. We could refer to each individual value in this array as a dog name. So just something to bear in mind when sort of considering what to be sort of naming your arrays, when, spoiler alert, you'll be declaring your own in your challenges following this session. So just have a quick look at what we've done there. So this is our, let me just get rid of that color palette. So this is our declaration statement here. So just exactly the same as we were doing this morning, we've used a const declaration keyword to declare a variable. We've provided a label or an identifier for that variable. It's the, oh, sorry, that's happened 2 in 1. We've got the exact same assignment operator as before. We're stipulating to JavaScript the following value is to be housed inside of this variable. And these square brackets are the array literal syntax. So that's what determines that this is indeed an array. And we've been able to place those values comma separated directly inside. So each of these individual values, when housed inside an array, we would refer to as an array element. A value that belongs to an array is known as an element. And in terms of how these are actually stored, we mentioned there was an order, as in Max isn't just in this list, Max is in the first position in this list. Fido is in the second position in the array, and so on. So we would define the terminology for how we define the position that a particular element is found is referred to as an array's index position. So an index for an array is just the position at which it occurs at, and arrays have numerical indexes starting at 0. So the first element in an array is always at index position 0, and the more elements that we introduce, just consecutively and numerically, we will just increment that index position to account for that. Cool. So we've got this array of dog names now. How can we actually get into that array, and how can we access an individual element? So accessing elements here. We can reference, well, we want to be able to reference the name of the variable storing the array. I'll tell you what, let's just come back to, sorry, I'm on the wrong screen. So at the moment here, if I wanted to console log, not just the entire dog names array, but I want to access just the string max. So I'm going to console log. I'm still going to reference the name of that array. I'm going to reference the name of the variable storing the array. But then we can add something known as a refinement. And I'm going to use the square bracket syntax, so the exact same square bracket syntax that we've used to create the array itself. And what we provide inside of these square brackets is the index position at which the element lives that we want to access. So if I want to access max, max is the first element in the array at index position 0. So I'm going to access dog names, square brackets, 0. And let's just run that code, and we can see that we are now exclusively referencing the value max, the string max in our console now. And just coming back to that sort of term refinement here, we're sort of, you can sort of think of this principle almost like, like heading to the supermarket and then narrowing down what you're looking for based on going to the right aisle. Like we still need to access the overall array, and then we add a refinement saying now we're narrowing down our search within that array as to which element we want to actually access. Cool. And then if I wanted to log Muttley to the console here, I might just throw this one out. What would we need to put inside of here? What index position would we want to reference if we wanted to console log Muttley? Cool, 222. Matt, I don't know if you're using the bang operator for 2 there, or if you're just exclaiming your answer, but absolutely. Dog names, square brackets, index position 2. Fantastic, cool, and there we have it. So just to quickly, again, just to sort of break down exactly what we've done there, accessing dog name 0, we're going to reference the array itself. Our square brackets is known as that refinement, narrowing down the search as to what we're looking for. And the value, the numerical value that we provide here is the index position of the desired element that we wish to access. Cool. So that's us just that's just us currently looking at an array element. Ooh, excuse me. So can I just have a quick round of thumbs, please? How do we feel just about anything we've just discussed so far? Cool. Beautiful. Full arms raised from Liban there. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. Cool. Right. Just a question from Aaron there. Said, if there were like 100 names, how would you find a certain name and its number? So in terms of finding something within an array, that's a little bit more complex because we would need to know its index position. You better believe that. One thing I will say now is usually, so much of the time, questions like, is such and such possible? It's almost always yes. It's almost always yes. There certainly is a way to do that, but I don't want to spoil the fun. That might be part of your voyage of discovery this afternoon when sort of looking through your challenges. Cool. So one thing I would just like to highlight here is that there are only 3 elements inside of this array. So let's say, for example, that I want to access the dog names array. The element at the index position of 5, which does not exist. It does not exist. So I just want to highlight what we might see here. When we run that, we're getting that value that we discussed earlier, undefined. Undefined being JavaScript's way of just representing the lack of a value. Not that null where it was that intentional lack of a value. We've tried to access something that doesn't exist. Notice how there's no error here. It hasn't broken, but it's just that the value that we've tried to access is undefined. There is no value there. So I just wanted to highlight just that little nuance of accessing an element in an array which doesn't actually exist. Cool. So something else that we want to do with this array. At the moment, we're declaring our arrays and we're just going to be playing around with them for the purposes of just experimentation. But it's perfectly reasonable that in code that you're writing going forward, you might not have created this array. It might have been provided to your program via some other means. So let's say, for example, we just wanted to check how many elements are inside of this array. How many elements are inside of here? So we can again access the dog name, access the array via its variable name. And we can now append what we call a property, and we will discuss that term coming up shortly, of length. So we can access dog names dot length. And if we console log that, we run it, we can see that we get the length, we get the number 3. So arrays in JavaScript possess this length property, which can reveal the amount of elements it contains. And this is going to be useful later on. But you can also think of an array's length of just being one more than its largest occupied index. So we know that our index positions were 0, 1, and 2. So its length is 3 for that reason, if that makes sense. Just remembering that, yeah, arrays are 0 indexed. So that takes a little bit of getting used to, because as humans, we can't naturally start counting from 1. It's very common that machines start counting from 0. So we just have to take that into account quite commonly. Cool. Any questions just about accessing that length there or seeing the undefined value? Or should I just say, can I have some thumbs if we feel happy about that? Or even some down thumbs if we feel unhappy about that, please. Cool. Okay, beautiful. Right then. So we've got this array in place. What I would now like to have a look at is something called mutations. Now, that's a piece of terminology that you may come across, and you certainly will come across it going forward, but you may see it on MDN. You may see it if you're on Stack Overflow while Googling something, for example. But a mutation to an array basically means we're just modifying that array. We're making a change to that array. So what I'd like to be doing here is, given that this array represents just like an ordered list, it's just a list of items. So just like a pen and paper list that we might have in real life, we can add new items to that list. We can remove items from that list. We can make changes to items in place in that list. We can do this. So I might just do an example first. We can do this using the same reassignment process that we've been using with our variables so far. So what I would like to do is I would like to replace Fido in this list with another dog name of Wilson. So what I'm going to do is here, I'm going to say dog names. So accessing that array. Let's add in that refinement. I want to access the element at index position 1. And once we've accessed that, we can use the assignment operator just like we were doing before. And we can now say, right, its new value is something completely different. So I'm going to say dog names 1 equals Wilson. And then just going to console log these dog names. And we can see that by the time we've got to line 6, that array has indeed been updated. We've completely overwritten the second element in this array, the element at index position 1, to be a completely new value. Cool. So one thing I would just really like to highlight here is we discussed earlier the significance of the const declaration keyword versus the let declaration keyword. Const was when we were declaring a constant variable, a value for which we're deciding should never change after its declaration. And the let keyword was for declaring a variable that is open to reassignment. We can apply a brand new value to that variable. So I'd just like to highlight here that there is absolutely no error. There's no problem with us doing this. There's no problem with us doing this at all, because what we've effectively said here is dog names is this array. Now, all we have reassigned here is one of the elements inside that array. We haven't attempted to reassign the whole array. So I would just like to quickly show us the difference there. So I'm going to leave that in view, but I'm going to comment that out. So just remembering that this line will no longer run when running this code. And then now just try to say dog names equals, and I'll tell you what, I'm just going to take this one and try to just make it be the exact same value that we were otherwise preparing for, right? But if we just run this code, we can see that unfortunately there's a problem with our code. Please check it again. That's because we're trying to reassign the value stored in a constant variable. Whereas what we're doing here is we're not reassigning the value stored by the variable. We're reassigning one of the elements stored by the array, which is in that variable. Does that make sense, what we're doing there? We're not reassigning the variable. We're just reassigning one of the elements in there. Cool. Okay, green tick there from Jack. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, brilliant. So just to quickly go over exactly what we've just seen. So that we've got that dog names array being declared. And we said dog names 1 equals Wilson. So what we've done is we've accessed this exact value here. And then using that the exact same assignment operator that we know and love from this morning, we've assigned it a new value. So we've just changed that element's value in place. We have not reassigned the whole array. We've just made a single modification to that array. Or specifically, we've made a single mutation to that array. Okay, cool. So then, coming back to this notion that arrays are ordered lists. They have so because they're ordered, we can think of them as having a start and an end, or a front and a back, if you will. So the sort of start of the array is here. The end is, however long it is, the last element in there. Okay, so in terms of some like just additional mutations that we can make here, let's come and have a look. So we've got our array of dog names still. I would now like to add a new dog name directly to the end of this list. So just like a moment ago, when we console logged, I'll just do this again, like dog names.length. where we can access the array and then use this dot, and then we can sort of access sub properties or like sub details about that array. There's a similar process at play that give us more actions, a bit like console log, things that do things, specifically functions in this case. So all arrays in JavaScript come sort of like pre-built in with some really handy tools to be able to make modifications to that array. So one of which is allowing us to add a brand new element to the end of the array, specifically the end. And the way we can do that is I'm going to reference the dog names array once again. And this particular function is known as push. So we can say dog names dot push. Because this is a function, just like we were using with console log, we need to use some parentheses to say actually enact that behavior, run that function. And just like with console log, when we're saying this is the value I want you to work with, we provide a value within these parentheses here. So I can now provide, I'm going to provide the string of Wilson. So we see we've got the initial declaration. We're now making we're performing a mutation on this array. We're pushing a new string. And if we now console log dog names, we can see that Wilson is now a string that's in index position 3 in this array. It's been added to the end of this array. And it might be quite nice, actually, if we have a look at the length as well. I'll tell you what, I'm going to console log the length just before, just so we can really highlight this. So dog names, dot length. In fact, sorry, I do apologize. Before we push it in. So we've got the array, we've console logged the length, which is 3. We've then pushed the string Wilson into that array. We've console logged dog names. So it now has an extra name in there, and the length is now 4. So it's just useful to note that arrays on the house are keeping track of that length property. They're handling things for us in terms of adding new elements into that array. So this push method, oh, excuse me. Oh no. Sorry, it sounded like that was a point was to be made there. Cool. So when we said dog names.push, we are specifically adding that element to the end of that array. Cool. Any questions about what we've just seen there? Cool, cool. Sorry, I keep inverting the way I question that. As in, Jack, is that you have a question? That's thumbs up that there are no questions. You're feeling good. Although I appreciate you can't answer that with just a thumb either. So I'll take it as that unless you say otherwise. Okay, so I'd like to explore just a couple more of these functions here that allow us to manipulate the arrays, and we'll sort of have them referred to as array methods. These functions that are sort of specific to arrays and interact with that array specifically are known as array methods. So instead of, let me just get rid of some of these then. So what I'd now like to do is I would like to remove the last element from this array. I'm sorry, Muttley, your time has come. You need to leave this array. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a method that, again, already exists, and this one is known as pop. Dog names.pop. Now, the pop method is, oh, perfect. Even the code editors even giving us a nice little highlight as to what this method does. It says, oh, it removes the last element from an array and returns it. So don't worry about that term, returns it. We'll be getting to that tomorrow. But let's just have a quick look. So we've got Max, Fido, and Muttley in the array. We're running the function dognames.pop and run the code. Now that array only consists of Max and Fido. We've removed the last element from this array. Noting here that just sort of coming to have a little look at that in play. So if we then dognames.pop from this one here, in this, sorry, it's a slightly different example to what we just saw. Wilson is the last element. So Wilson has now been removed, and now it's back to just those original 3. So note here that we have not had to provide any sort of value to pop. We haven't had to say pop Muttley or pop Wilson. We haven't had to specify what we want to remove, because the inherent behavior of this pop function, this array method, is to remove the last element, whatever it is. So when we were pushing, we needed to provide the value that we wanted to go in there. When we're popping, it's irrelevant what that value is. It says, just remove it, get it out from the end of that list. Cool. So very similarly, we're able to, there are two really useful methods. Oh, excuse me, someone, I'll tell you what, let me just mute us all here just to be safe. Cool. There are a couple of other useful methods that will allow us to add and remove array elements, but from the start of the array, from the sort of first index position in. So if I wanted to, if I now wanted to add Wilson to the start of the array, we have, well, I'll tell you what, no, let's remove Max. Let's remove Max from the start of this array. The method is known as shift. So dognames.shift is, thank you, I've just had that in the chat as a recommendation as well. Thank you very much indeed. Dognames.shift, let's run that code. We can see that now one has been removed, but specifically from the start. Specifically from the start of that array. And one thing that's useful to note here is the index position of the first element in an array is always 0. It's always 0. So let me just console log dog names before we actually shift Max from there. Excuse me, what have I done here? Sorry, I do apologize. I've just exposed a bit of a limitation in our system. I won't explain that this way. I will explain it in the sense that Max was at index position 0, Fido at 1, Muttley at 2. When we popped and we removed the last element, none of the other index positions needed to change. Max is still index position 0, Fido is still index position 1. However, removing from the start of the array, when we shifted, Fido is now in the first position. So what we can do here is I'm now just going to console log dog names 0, just to clarify that JavaScript has handled on the house shuffling down all those index positions for us so that they all take the place of the previous element, accounting for the first one that we have just removed. Cool. So that's us removing an element from the start. That was the shift method. In order for us to introduce a brand new element to the start of the array, we have sort of the opposite of that, the unshift method. And this one, again, we will want to provide a value because we need to specify what new value are we actually introducing to the start of this array. So let's just have a quick look at this. Well, I'll leave that as, so we've got, again, just our initial dog names. We're dog names.unshift Wilson. Let's run that code. We see here that now Wilson is in the first index position 0, highlighted further by us console logging specifically dog names 0, and we're getting just that string as is. Cool. So, and just to quickly recap that. So push will add an element to the end of an array. Pop will remove an element from the end of an array. If we wanted to shift, that will remove an element from the start of an array. And if we want to unshift, that will add an element to the start of an array. So 4 useful methods there that are quite useful. They're useful in that they're quite useful, but you'll be using those fairly regularly, especially in sort of the in the upcoming challenges for you this afternoon. So one thing that I would just like to highlight is let's just head back to the wonderful MDN docs. So if we head to MDN and references into JavaScript, and again, if we went to those built-in objects, we have this one listing right near the top here, array. And this, again, a very, very comprehensive rundown of exactly what an array is and what sort of behaviors that they enact. So I would definitely say, please do have a little look through this. But you can see we've now got this. One thing I'll say is that there's this name here that says like properties. So this one thing I am comfortable to say at this stage is you'll see that it says like array.prototype.length rather than just array.length, which is what we used. For the time being, please just disregard this term prototype. It will crop up in the future. Okay. So you can go here, just have a little bit of, again, just a full a full description as to what the length property does, how you access it, and again, a little coding sandbox, just like our platform, where you can play around and just make some changes. And we've also got this list of methods here. Now, again, ignoring the prototype word, this is all of the different methods, or like functions that exist specifically for arrays that are available out of the box. Every array that you declare in JavaScript, or every array that you even use in JavaScript, you might not have declared it yourself, has the ability to utilize all of these behaviors. So if we go to this push one here, that's the one that we were just using to add an element to the array. There's a nice description of exactly how it works, that coding sandbox again, and further down, some really in-depth use cases. So I can't recommend enough just nipping to MDN every now and then, just have a look up a new method, or even if you're wanting to sort of find out how to do something with an array, that might be something that you Google, and you might find that you find a link to the MDN docs telling you, oh, there's actually a built-in array method that already does what you're trying to do here. So just trying to say, like, I can't stress enough the importance of coming back to this documentation and really just studying the official, this is the official sort of be all and end all in terms of how JavaScript works, and just coming to have a little look around and just playing around in here. Cool. So any questions just on using, as I say, we've just gone through 4 array methods there. There are many, many more of which we will ask you to, in your challenges, to look up independently and just sort of figure out how they work. Can I have some thumbs on this form of array mutation, making changes to an array in place, not necessarily reassigning the array itself? Cool. And I really appreciate these thumbs up, but I don't want anyone to feel guilty or sort of like singled out if you do have any questions. Okay, that's the whole point. Okay, cool. So a thing I would just like to have a little look at here is, let's just come back through. Sorry, I've just come back to the end of my animation timeline. So just give me a second. Sorry, I know we've just said that, but MDN is the place to go for details on any array method. Okay, so I would like to just have a quick touch on something called a nested array, or nested arrays. So just like variables in JavaScript, they can hold any value whatsoever. An array element, just like a variable, can be of any value, any data type whatsoever. And that even includes another array. So it's very, very possible, if not likely, that you're going to be coming across arrays that have other arrays as elements inside of there. So once we access the nested array, we can access elements inside of it just as before. So I'd like to just go through one example of accessing an element in a nested array, and then we can move on. So let's just get rid of all. Let's just have a nice clean start. And I'm going to Blue Peter this one. Here's one that I created earlier. Cool. So I have an array here, and it's just called nested letters. So it is itself an array, but and one thing I would just say is it's just the way that this is laid out. With all this being on one line, we've got the first element here, which is an array, comma separated is the second element. But just for the purposes of visualizing it a little bit more neatly, we can just spread it onto a couple of lines. Like in fact, I probably should have said that this morning, that JavaScript in most sort of regards isn't sort of like white space sensitive. So you can use this to your advantage just to make your code more readable and just a bit easier to reason about what's going on. So the first element here is an array which itself contains 3 elements, the letters A, B, C. And the second element is another array which itself contains 3 elements, this time the strings D, E, F. So just to hit home that terminology, like arrays stored inside other arrays are referred to as nested arrays. They're just nested inside another. And this is just like sort of one level of nesting. This can go deep. It can go as deep as you like, but we'll leave it at this level just for the time being, right? So in order to access an element in a nested array, we can just make an extension to the syntax that we were using earlier to add some more specificity to what we called that refinement. So let's console log. So I want to console log the letter A here, for example. So if I console log at the moment, like nested letters, and let's just have a look at that. That's the entire array. That's our entire variable. So we can add our refinement with that square bracket syntax, and we want to look for the element at index position 0. So if we run that code, we can see that that is now this array here. That's the first element. That's the array, which is the first element in nested letters. So once we've got this far, we can just add what we can add another refinement. We can say that we've gone to the array, we've got to that first nested array, and now once we're in there, we can just append some more square brackets and say if everything here evaluates to an array, this one we're looking at on the right-hand side, then inside of that array, I want to access element 0. And if we run that code, we can see that now we're accessing specifically that character, just that string A. Cool. How do we feel about this notion of arrays within arrays? Because arrays, again, array elements, just like variables in JavaScript, are welcome to store any data type whatsoever. So I might just pose a bit of a question. I would like to console log the letter F. I would like to console log the letter F here. Would anyone feel brave enough to give us a suggestion as to how we might do that? How might we console log the string F on the right-hand side here? Cool, very, very nice. So, okay, right, we're getting a couple of different answers, which is great. And I'm not trying to single anybody out. The fact that we're also like thinking about this, we're coming up with some different suggestions is wonderful. One thing I would really like to highlight here is if ever you answer anything in one of these sessions and it turns out to be incorrect, or you're going through your challenges and you weren't right first time, this might sound mean, but that's great. Being wrong is wonderful because it means you're on the cusp of readjusting your understanding as to what you think is happening. Okay, so let's have a little look then. So I'm going to be really specific and I'm going to go for the ones with those square brackets there. So let's just really bear in mind where we want to get to. So if we just go back to console logging those nested letters, where there are only 2 elements in this array, and F lives in the second one. So that's at index position 1. So we're going to go to nested letters, square brackets 1. And once we're here, this array has 3 elements. The one that we're wanting to access is at index position 2. So in this particular case, nested letters, square brackets 1, square brackets 2 is the ticket. Cool. Right, wonderful. And I want to say thank you very much because that was a real slew of suggestions that I got in the chat there. Thank you very much indeed. Okay then, right. In terms of arrays, you better believe that they're capable of much, much more than we've just discussed. But I'm going to leave it there for now because I'd like to have a little look at objects. Okay, so arrays and objects being the 2 topics for this afternoon. An object is just another form of container in JavaScript, but let's have a little look at it specifically. So first of all, I would like for us to consider this array here. This array, and let's just have a little look at what we're looking at. And well, I suppose if anyone happens to know what we're actually looking at, please pop that in the chat. If anyone happens to be able to discern what's this information actually representing here. But that's not a question that's on the syllabus, I assure you. But that sort of leads to the point. Cool. An object, well, it'd be nice if it was an object. Toy Story, cool. This is indeed some data about the film Toy Story. Now, looking at the way it's presented here, it's not necessarily the greatest format, right? Because arrays are great for storing related values where the order is useful, or when we have those dog names where all of the same data type. It's just a collection where the order isn't necessarily relevant, but it's all that there's no necessary, the name of the array. So that variable like dog names, for example, is enough information to describe what's being held in there. However, sometimes we want to associate data that does relate to each other. So all this data makes sense to be in its own container because it's all related. However, it's not necessarily in an order. Now, we are correct. This is information about the film Toy Story. But each element is a different data type. So we've got a string, we've got 2 numbers, we've got an array inside of there, we've got another number to follow. We can make inferences at best as to what what each of these elements in this array is meant to represent. We'd be guessing, but there's no sort of there's no sort of like clear-cut representation as to exactly what these are. So data like this would be more suited, or I should say better suited, to like a table, right? Sort of a bit of sort of like spreadsheet format where we've got some columns and some rows, so we can apply some clear labels as to like which each, to further describe what each piece of data is representing. So that can be sort of described in this way here. So just saying Toy Story data has a director, which is John Lasseter. It has a release year, which is 1995. A box office in GBP, which is like 272 million. I think it seemed to do well. Starring, so just to add a bit of, it's to just add a little bit of reasoning as to what this array is meant to represent here, like runtime in minutes. So there's no reason that director needs to come first. Director isn't sort of at the start of this list. It's just in this data set. But having these labels clearly define what each of these pieces of data is much more useful to us for this sort of data. And the way that this is laid out now, this is indeed an object in JavaScript. I don't know if we can see all that's happening there. So I've just added a declaration keyword of const, that assignment operator. Where's my pen gone? The assignment operator. We've got two curly braces. So just like with arrays, we had the two square bracket syntax to represent an array. We're using curly brace syntax to represent an object here. And this is already syntactically sound. We have a label and a colon followed by the value, and then we just comma separate each of these sort of label and value pairs. Cool. This is a JavaScript object. Now, just like array elements had an array elements accessible via an index, objects have what we call properties. So we would say that John Lasseter here is a property. And just like, again, with an array, an element had an index defining how to access it in the array. Objects have properties with what we call a key, telling us how to access it from within that object. So objects have a key and a value pair. So that term key value pair is going to be quite common, but that key value pair sort of together we would refer to as a property of an object. Cool. So the thing that I would really like to stress about an object is, because we no longer have numerical consecutive indexes or indices, I'll say indexes, just to represent the position in which elements are found. That's not the case with objects. They just have keys to represent that. So we should think of objects as unordered lists. We should think of objects as unordered lists. Even though there's technically an order in terms of us visualizing it right now, directors at the top, then release year, then box office. But if we were to mix around the order here, it makes no difference in terms of how we interact with the object. So I just really want to just hammer home a distinction there between arrays being ordered lists and objects being unordered lists. Cool. Sorry, Simon there. So is John Lasseter a property, a value, or both? Cool. So I would say, let me just, if I were to give this the official name of like a value. So if we say the key is director and the value is John Lasseter, but when we sort of combine those terms, we would say the director property of Toy Story data object is John Lasseter. So the key is the label, the value is the actual value, the property is our way of sort of describing that key value pair sort of in tandem, if you will. Does that make sense? Because thank you very much for calling me up on that, because I did just sort of like skip over that a little bit. And I'll just quickly answer that question. So with that dot has own property, would you include director in brackets and console would return John Lasseter? What a wonderful question. Let's have a little bit of an exploration into what's happening here then. So let's go back to our, excuse me. Cool, let's just head back to our little coding sandbox here. Get rid of that nested letters array. And let's have a look at this. So in terms of accessing properties, now, one thing I would just like to say is all keys in objects are strings. All keys in objects are string values. Now, because this is just a given rule for objects, JavaScript lets us get away without specifying those sort of quote marks around the key here. So, for example, let me just console log Toy Story data. And let's just see what that actually looks like when we print it. Cool. It's sort of the beauty of it sort of been mangled just a little bit in terms of the console log, but we can see that we've got all of these key value pairs together. And we can even see here on this side that it's being represented as director as being within quote marks, just around that director is indeed a string. So if we were to put all of these inside of quotes, as if they were strings, the behavior is identical. The behavior is identical. So just to clarify, all keys in objects are always strings. But because that is just a rule that JavaScript imposes, it lets us get away with saying, yep, we know they're strings. So it's just a little bit sort of nicer for us to look at without having to input, having to actually implement those either double or single quotes every time. Cool. So then, in terms of accessing an individual property here, we can do that in the exact same way as we just did with arrays. We can do it in the exact same way with the exact same syntax as with arrays. We're going to reference the object by its name, by its variable name, and we're going to add a refinement. So we can use those square brackets, but instead of providing an index position here, we're going to provide the name of the key for the property that we would like to view. So if we want to see the director, I'm going to pass inside of here the string director. Let's run that code. And we see that we're accessing John Lasseter specifically now. So again, this is our refinement, the name of the object, square brackets to narrow down our search, and then we provide the value of the key, the name of the key that we're wanting to access, which is indeed a string. Cool. If I wanted to access just the release year, we would do the exact same thing. And we're getting 1995. Cool. So similarly to why we're able to get away with not putting quote marks around the key names here, because it's just sort of a given that they are strings, JavaScript lets us get away with a nice little shorthand for when we want to access those properties too. So instead of using square brackets here, we can use what we call dot notation. And this already looks very similar to when we're accessing the length of an array, right? When we're doing like array.length or array.pop. We can access a property using this dot notation, and then we don't need to provide those quote marks. And just to clarify, when I run this code, we're getting the exact same output. JavaScript's interpreting it in the same way, but this is arguably a little bit easier for the developer. It's a bit nicer for us to read what's going on and really clarify exactly what's happening. So Toy Story data, the dot notation is appending that refinement, narrowing down our search, getting to release year. Cool. So this use of dot notation is probably going to be much, much more common that you use that, and you'll probably see it more regularly. And one thing I would just like to clarify is when we accessed an element in an array at an index position that didn't exist, what was the value that we saw? What was the value that we logged when we tried to access an element in an array that was at an index position that sort of burst the banks, if you will? It was beyond the available indexes. Undefined. Cool, undefined. So if I would say like Toy Story data dot title here and try and look for a property that doesn't exist, we get the exact same behavior. It gets the exact same behavior because arrays and objects behind the scenes work very, very similarly. But arrays are ordered with indexes, objects are unordered with keys. Cool. Okay then. So it is 5-3. So I will just try and pick the pace up myself. But any questions, please, as I say, have them coming into the chat. I will do my best to come back to those. So then let's have another look at that term mutations. Let's make some alterations to this object itself. So this also can be done in the exact same way. That could also be done in the exact same way that we did with arrays. So I want to change the director here. Okay, so I'm going to say Toy Story data, Toy Story data dot director. So we've now accessed that property, and then we can use the assignment operator to just overwrite it. And I can say, I don't know, Steven Spielberg came and did a really top-notch version. And let's have a look. Let's just now have a look at that Toy Story data dot director property. When we run that code, it's now been set at Steven Spielberg. We've just accessed the property directly, used the same old assignment operator that we know and love, and just applied a new value. Cool. And just coming back to that notion, because we can already see here, right, that one of the properties in this object is an array. So as we've said, variables can hold any data type. Elements in an array can hold any data type, including arrays or objects. And objects, properties, can hold, again, any data type, including arrays or objects. So this we can just have arrays within objects within arrays. We're not going to push you to that stage like just yet, we assure you, so please don't worry, but that is a possibility here. Cool. So then, we've just amended a property. Let's, cool, right. I'm going to come back sort of to that question, but you are absolutely, but thank you for asking it, Aaron. And Liban, again, you have to forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that. That is absolutely correct, but we'll come to that momentarily. In fact, no, now you brought it up. Let's have a quick look now, shall we? Let's have a quick look now. So we want to console log Tom Hanks. Let's console log Tom Hanks. So I'm just going to get rid of, no, we're not going to change the director again. So Steven Spielberg directed this one. So this is that refinement again, right? So if we run that code, we're console logging the whole Toy Story object. So if we wanted to get to this array, that's under the property of starring. So if we just console log Toy Story data.starring, now we've got to the array. Once we're at this array, we interact with it just like we would with any other array. And we can use those square brackets. Oh, sorry, not there, but there. We can use those square brackets just like we were doing before. So I want to access the starring property of Toy Story data, which is an array, and I'd like to access the element at index position 0 inside that array property. And if we run that code, whoa, cool. Give me one second. Let's just bring that back. Okay, as I say, I did Blue Peter this one. Cool, let's just try again. I'm not sure what happened there, so apologies. So we're going to console log Toy Story data dot starring at the index position of 0. And let's run that code. And we're getting Tom Hanks. Cool. So thank you very much for asking that, because that prompted me just to mention that a little bit sooner. Are there any questions? Oh, no, I'll tell you what, can we have some thumbs on this, or just how we're feeling about we're accessing this nested array inside of this object at the moment? Cool. Quite a slew of thumbs. I'm seeing Simon, you're literally waving it from side to side as well. I love it. Very clear for me. Thank you. Cool. So we just experimented with adding, changing an object's property. So let's just bring that back in. So that was Toy Story data dot director, and we changed that to the string Steven Spielberg. Cool. Don't need to camel case Steven Spielberg. That's absolutely fine. And if we just go back to console logging the whole array, the whole object, we can see that now its director property has indeed been updated. So how can we add a new property here? Sorry, question from Michael there. Just to be clear, starring is a property, not an element. Yes, absolutely. Starring is a property in the object. Tom Hanks is an element in the array held by the starring property. So yes, arrays have properties. Excuse me. Objects have properties. Arrays have elements. So even though this property is indeed an array, it's still a property itself of the object. Cool. Thank you just for clarifying that. Cool. So in terms of adding a brand new property, objects are unordered lists. Objects don't have a start or an end. So when we wanted to add an element to the end of an array, we use that push method. or if we wanted to add an element to the start of the array, we use the unshift method. There's no start or end to an object, so we don't have methods that allow us to add new properties. However, we can actually add a new property using the exact same syntax that we've used here to reassign an existing property. So let's, well, we console logged the title earlier and it was undefined. Let's now actually introduce a title. So I can say Toy Story data.title equals Toy Story. And let's now console, yeah, let's just console log the whole thing. Cool. So we can see that line 9 is a property reassignment, changing the value of an existing property. Line 11 is property creation, the introduction of a brand new property into this object. And we can see here, we've now got a title property set to the string of Toy Story. And one thing I would just like to say is, it looks like this is the last property, if you will, in this object, because it's at the end of the list. That's purely how the console needs to display them in some sort of order so that we can see them. But please don't make no mistake, this object doesn't have an order. It's just unordered collections of properties. Cool. Oh, I'm sorry, Michael there. Starring is also a key. Yes, it is. So the key is starring. The value is this array, but we would access the sort of that key value pair combined is referred to as the property. So when we say Toy Story.title equals Toy Story, we've added a Toy Story property to this object here. Cool, cool. Thank you for clarifying. So yeah, just to clarify that the similarity, well, I say the similarity, it's identical syntax. If we access a property that already exists and we reassign it, we're updating that property. If we access a property that doesn't exist, we're creating a brand new one with the exact same syntax here. Cool, cool. If we wanted to, sorry, just catch up a couple of questions here from Simon. Can an object have methods? Yes, it can, and it certainly does. However, at this stage, I'm not going to be delving into any of them, but they certainly can. But where can we go if we want to look up any methods that an object might have? We can head to MDN and see what's available to us, see what inbuilt behavior that they offer us right out of the box. So yes, Simon, they do have methods, but beyond the scope of what I'd like to be discussing just in this session. Cool. Cool. Another question in there. Would you add an element to an array? Sorry, would you add an element to an array in an object the same way? Well, short answer is yes. When we saw that we were console logging Tom Hanks earlier, we were console logging Toy Story data.starring. But once we get to that array, we can interact with it just like an array. So let's have a look at that. Let's push. I can't remember who else was in that. I think Tom Cruise was in the remastered edition of Toy Story, right? I seem to believe. Let's just console log Toy Story. In fact, sorry, no, I don't want to console log that. I just want to run that. So I'm going to say Toy Story data.starring, which is this array. Once it's an array, we can use that push method that we already explored. And now if we console log Toy Story data.starring, after that's taken place, we can see that that array now has Tom Cruise at the end of it. So absolutely, yeah, we're accessing the array in a different way. We've got to go via the object, but that's all down to these refinements, narrowing down our search to what piece of data we're looking for. Once you get as far as you'd like, then you can interact with that piece of data as what it is. If we've got to an array, we can interact with it just like any other array in JavaScript. Cool, cool. So we've looked at editing a property. We've looked at adding a new property. Now, when we wanted to, if we want to remove a property from this object, let's have a little look. Again, because there's no order, we weren't able to push or unshift new elements to an object like we could with an array. Similarly, we're unable to pop or shift like an array. We're not able to just remove the last element from an object because the last one doesn't exist in that in terms of that notation. So if we want to remove a property here, I'm going to clear this away, just sort of tidy up a little bit. We can use the delete operator. Notice that this delete keyword is sort of highlighted in blue. It's a reserved keyword in JavaScript, and we can delete. And now we just reference the property that we'd like gone, that we'd like to remove. So if I now say like Toy Story data dot release year, I'm not interested as to when it came out. And then if we console log Toy Story data after deleting it, we should hopefully see there is no release year now present inside of this object. We've removed that property, and it was definitely there to begin with. It was definitely there when we declared the object. So if we've now removed that property, if I try to access Toy Story data.release year, what are we going to see in the console? Any predictions at all if that property has now been removed? Any thoughts as to what we might see here? Cool. Couple of guesses of undefined coming in. I like it. There's only one way to find out, right? Let's have a look. It is indeed undefined. Well done. It's exactly the same as what we did before. By the time we get to this console log, we've already deleted release year. So we're in the same way as we were before, trying to access a property that no longer exists. Cool. Right. Amazing. So I think there is one more thing that I would like to discuss before sending you on your merry way. So let's just remove this deleting for the time being. I would like to just briefly discuss what we call like dynamic property access. Okay, so when when we know the name of the key, ahead of time, let me just sort of bring a couple of these back. So for example, release year, right? We know that this object has a release year property. So we can just say Toy Story data.release year. Now, when the key we're trying to access is the result of an expression. So an expression from earlier was some sort of series of operations or a couple of combined values or something that JavaScript needs to figure out, if you will. It needs to sort of put a pin in what it's doing, figure out that value, evaluate it to a single value, and then it can be utilized. That was just a recap of our term expression. If we have a property that's a result of an expression, we're going to need to access it in a slightly different way. So this is going to seem a little bit mean, but I'm going to go down this route. So I'm going to declare a variable here called director. I'm going to declare a variable director. I'm going to set its value to be the string release year. Now, I would just like to say straight away, this is a terrible naming convention. Please don't feel like this needs implementing in your code, but it's purely just to sort of like get us thinking here. So this is the name of a variable director. This is the string that variable director now holds. So I now want to log the number 1995 to the console, just like we were doing before, but via this variable. So if I were to say Toy Story data.director, okay, and I'm actually just going to say, let's just 5 seconds just before I press this, just have a look at what's going on. Toy Story data.director here. If we run this code, we're getting John Lasseter, which makes sense, right? Because we just saw that before. We're accessing the object and then using dot notation to get to its property. Cool. So if we were to then go back to using those square brackets, and just to highlight that this is exactly the same, we provide the string value of director, saying Toy Story data, our refinement, which key we're trying to access, director, and we run the code, the exact same outcome. We're still getting that John Lasseter. Now, even though this is just a single string, this is indeed sort of classed as an expression. For example, if I were to do this, I'm now trying to access a property of the string Dyer concatenated with couture. And we run that code, we still get John Lasseter. And the reason for that is this is an expression. JavaScript needs to figure this out and evaluate it before the value can be utilized. So for that reason, if ever we need to have an expression evaluated that holds our key name, we must use square brackets. There's no way around it. That's how it has to be. So for that reason, if I were now to pass director directly in these square brackets, not the string, because now it's referencing our variable director here, now we get that number 1995, because this value is evaluating to, this variable, excuse me, is evaluating to the value that it holds, the string release year. So I appreciate, I have been very mean by naming that director, but that was sort of like by design. Any chance I could just have a round of thumbs? Because this is a little bit weird. This is a little bit weird. Cool. I've got 2 thumbs and a pen from Michael there. Cool. Thank you. I've got a couple of thumbs coming in. Are there any questions about this whatsoever from anybody? Cool. Yasmin there saying, can you use dot, so the dot notation and the block and the square brackets interchangeably, depending on what we need to do. So I will just discuss that again. So when we use the dot notation, that's when we must know the exact name of the key. It must literally be the text that we're putting after the dot. So when we use dot director, we get John Lasseter, because that's exactly the name of the property that we're looking for. If we used square brackets, that's asking JavaScript to first evaluate this expression, figure that out first, and then use the resulting value here. Cool. Well, I tell you, one thing that might sort of clarify that is, if I just bring an array back into play, so I'll get rid of, no, sorry, I'll leave that up just so we can see that, in play. I'm just going to bring an array down here. And in fact, no, I will blue pick this one again, just because I feel like this sometimes helps just like clarify exactly what's going on. So I'm going to get rid of that console. I'm going to not get rid of it, but comment out that console log. So that isn't actually executable code. And just have a look at this example down here. So I've declared a variable called index, and it has a value of the number 1. I've got an array of names here: Sam, Dave, and Maddie. And now what on a console log is names at index position 1. But instead of using the 1 directly, and just to clarify that this is working, we see Dave, we're just using a variable. But we're not, there's no index position in this array literally called index. We've provided a variable, we've provided an expression that JavaScript must evaluate first. So it figures out that that's the number 1, and then it uses that value to say, this is the index position that we're trying to access. So the way that we're accessing an array here with a variable representing the index is the exact same principle as to how we're accessing a property in this object here with an array, this property here with a variable holding its key name. Yasmin, brackets for expressions, yes. Okay, so for arrays, it's always going to be square brackets. It's always going to be square brackets. For objects, it's dot notation if you know the exact text, the exact name of the key. It's square brackets if it's an expression, if it's something that JavaScript needs to evaluate, it needs to figure out before it can access it. Cool. That is, at this point, everything I would like to discuss. Do we have any questions about anything we've discussed? / do we have any down thumbs? Is there anything we would like to quickly recap at all before we send you on your merry way for some more challenges this afternoon? Cool. I'll let that awkward silence sit for a little bit longer, just in case anyone's typing. I would say I'm paid by the hour. It's fine by, fine by me. Cool. Okay, then. Right. So just to quickly sort of highlight where I'd like for you to be heading this afternoon. So I appreciate. So we will grant access to session 2. So as I mentioned earlier, please disregard, don't worry at all about where you got up to in session 1. I would like for you to be moving on to session 2 while this content is as fresh in the mind as possible. And these are challenges designed specifically for arrays and objects. So if you head to like challenge 1, your first challenge is to declare an array containing strings of your favorite biscuits. So hopefully we've all got many, many, many favorite biscuits that we can populate this array with. Cool. And I believe there was sort of just to mention earlier that on the left-hand side, do note that this is like a scrollable list. So again, you're not expected to finish them all, but once you get to 7, do just check that there aren't any more to go through. That's all. The sessions or the days this week are advertised between 9:30 and 4. So technically, you've got 45 minutes before the end of the day just to see how far you get here. But traditionally, the North Coders Day ends at 5. So I'm saying if it gets to 4 o'clock and you're at a loose end and you go, oh, I'm not allowed to do any more coding, it's fine. You are welcome to sort of like carry this on, but please don't feel compelled to do so if you have other arrangements. And no matter what you do, at 5 o'clock, you shut your laptop, you go outside, go and stare at a tree. It's so important to just take time away from the machine as well, because you need that absorption time from what you've been learning today. So you need the time away just to let it sink in. So, I would say thank you very much indeed, everyone. If you want to just go head away, you'll get access to session 2, make a start on those. Any questions, get them in that Slack channel, and we will see you at 9:30 tomorrow, where we'll have a bit of a recap over today, and we'll be doing it all over again, jumping onto something new. So thank you very much, everyone. As I say, lovely to meet you all today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye for now.